The scent of cinnamon and baked apples, a ghost of his wife Eleanor's love, filled Samuel's small, tidy kitchen. At 80 years old, his movements were deliberate, but his heart was light. He hummed a tuneless, happy melody as he carefully placed a golden-crusted apple pie on the cooling rack. Today was a good day. His son, Robert, was bringing the family for a weekend visit. For Samuel, these visits were the highlights of his quiet life. Since Eleanor had passed 3 years ago, the large, comfortable house often felt too silent, its rooms echoing with memories. But when his son, his daughter-in-law Susan, and his beloved grandson Leo were here, the house came alive again. It filled with the sound of laughter, the slam of doors, and the cheerful chaos that only a 10-year-old boy can create. He had spent the entire morning preparing. The roast was seasoned and ready for the oven, the potatoes were peeled, and a fresh batch of lemonade, Leo's favorite, was chilling in the refrigerator. He looked around the immaculate living room at the polished wood floors and the framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Everything was perfect. He was a man content in his world, a world he had built with his own 2 hands, a world he looked forward to one day leaving to his son. At precisely 2 o'clock, he heard the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A surge of pure, uncomplicated joy washed over him. He smoothed down his sweater, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door, a wide, welcoming smile on his face. The car door opened, and Leo shot out like a cannonball, his small legs pumping as he raced across the lawn. "Grandpa!" he shouted, his voice full of the unrestrained delight that only a child can possess. Samuel knelt, his old knees protesting slightly, and caught his grandson in a tight embrace. The boy's small arms wrapped around his neck, and for a moment the world was perfect. "There's my champion," Samuel said, ruffling Leo's sandy hair. "Did you bring your chessboard? I've been practicing." But as he pulled back, he saw that Leo's bright, happy expression was gone. It had been replaced by a look of profound, adult-like anxiety. The boy's eyes darted nervously toward the car, where Robert and Susan were now unloading their bags. "What is it, son?" Samuel asked, his smile faltering. "Is something wrong?" Leo shook his head, but his eyes were wide with a fear that made Samuel's blood run cold. He glanced back at his parents again, then leaned in close to his grandfather, his small hand gripping Samuel's arm with surprising strength. His voice was a frantic, desperate whisper, a sound so out of place in the sunny afternoon that it felt like a shard of ice against Samuel's ear. "Grandpa," he breathed, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Pretend you're poor. Tell them you have money problems. Please, just trust me." Samuel stared at his grandson, utterly bewildered. The request was so bizarre, so nonsensical, that he almost laughed. But the look in Leo's eyes stopped him. It was not a child's game. It was genuine, gut-wrenching fear. "What are you talking about, Leo?" Samuel began, but his grandson shook his head fiercely, his eyes pleading. "Just do it, Grandpa. Please, for me." Robert and Susan were now walking toward them, their faces arranged in the pleasant, slightly strained smiles they always wore when they visited. "Dad," Robert said, his voice a little too hearty, "good to see you. The place looks great, as always." "You're looking well, Samuel," Susan added, her eyes scanning the house, the garden, the well-maintained facade of his life. Samuel stood up, his mind reeling. He looked from his son's confident, easy smile to his grandson's terrified, pleading eyes, and in that moment he made a choice. He would trust the fear. He would trust the boy. "It's good to see you, too," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He forced a small, weary sigh. "Though, to be honest, things have been a bit tight lately." He saw a flicker of something in Robert's eyes. It was not concern. It was not sympathy. It was a quick, sharp, almost imperceptible flash of interest. It was there and gone in a second, replaced by a mask of filial concern. "Tight? What do you mean, Dad?" Robert asked, his voice laced with a new solicitous tone. "Oh, you know," Samuel said, waving a dismissive hand as he led them into the house. "The usual. Investments haven't been doing so well. The pension doesn't go as far as it used to. Just the worries of an old man." He watched them as they walked into his home. He saw the quick, meaningful glance that passed between his son and his daughter-in-law. He saw the way their smiles became a little more genuine, a little less strained, and he felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of his stomach. His grandson's whispered warning had not been a child's fantasy. It was an alarm bell, a siren in the quiet afternoon. And he had just stepped into the heart of the storm. The performance had begun. The weekend unfolded like a play. With Samuel as the unwitting lead in a drama he was only just beginning to understand. He moved through the familiar rooms of his house, but they felt different, charged with a new, insidious tension. He was an actor on a stage, and his audience was his own family. At dinner that evening, he continued his performance, guided by the memory of Leo's terrified eyes. As he carved the roast, he let out a small, carefully rehearsed sigh. "I hope there's enough for leftovers," he said, his voice tinged with a manufactured anxiety. "The price of meat these days, it's getting harder and harder to manage." He watched them from under his lowered eyelids. Susan, who normally picked at her food, served herself a generous portion, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Robert, who usually talked about his latest business deal, was unusually attentive, his questions laced with a cloying, solicitous concern. "Dad, you should have told us you were having trouble," Robert said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We can help. We're family." "Oh, it's nothing," Samuel said, waving his hand dismissively. "Just the usual grumbles of an old man. I'll be fine." "No, really," Susan chimed in, her voice a little too bright. "We've been worried about you, all alone in this big house. It must be so expensive to maintain. The heating bills alone." "The house is fine," Samuel said, a protective instinct rising in him. "Your mother and we paid it off years ago." "But the property taxes," Robert pressed, "and the upkeep. It's a lot for one person to handle, especially on a fixed income." They were like vultures, circling, testing, probing for weakness. Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a path toward a destination he could not yet see, but which he knew was bleak and cold. Leo was silent throughout the meal. He ate his food with his head down, his small shoulders hunched. But every now and then, he would glance up at Samuel, his eyes a mixture of fear and encouragement. He was a co-conspirator in a plot he didn't fully comprehend, a silent partner in his grandfather's deception. Later that evening, while Robert and Susan were watching a movie in the living room, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur, Leo found Samuel in the study. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out their old, worn chessboard, and set it up on the small table by the window. It was their secret language. Chess was the sacred ground where he and Samuel had always connected. Eleanor had taught them both to play, and after her death, it had become their ritual, a quiet space where they could be together without the need for words. As they played, the tension in Leo's small body seemed to melt away. He was a surprisingly skilled player for a 10-year-old with a sharp, intuitive mind. "They think you're going to lose the house," Leo whispered, his eyes fixed on the board as he moved his knight. Samuel's hand froze over his rook. "What makes you say that, son?" "I heard them talking," Leo said, his voice barely audible. "In the car. Mom said that if you don't have any money, you won't be able to stay here. She said you'll have to downsize." The word hung in the air between them, a sterile corporate euphemism for exile. "Your mother is just worried about me," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. Leo looked up, and his eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were old, wise, and full of a terrible, premature understanding. "No, Grandpa," he said softly. "They're not worried. They're happy." He moved his bishop, placing Samuel's king in check. "They think they're going to win." The game continued in silence, each move a silent conversation. Samuel felt a profound, aching love for this small, brave boy who was trying so desperately to protect him. Leo was not just his grandson. He was his ally, his only source of truth in a house suddenly filled with lies. The next day, the performance continued. Susan helped Samuel in the kitchen, tut-tutting over his extravagant use of butter and suggesting cheaper, store-brand alternatives. Robert offered to look over his finances, to help him create a budget, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light as he asked about Samuel's savings and investments. Samuel played his part perfectly. He feigned confusion, gratitude, a dawning sense of helpless dependence. He allowed them to believe they were in control, that their concern was working, that he was slowly but surely accepting his new role as a poor, helpless old man who needed their guidance. But in the quiet moments, in the shared glances with Leo, in the silent games of chess, another reality was taking shape. They were a team, a silent, two-person army fighting a secret war. Leo, with his innocent, observant eyes, was his scout, his intelligence agent. And Samuel, with a lifetime of wisdom and a secret they could not even begin to imagine, was the general, patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal his true strength. The performance was exhausting, but it was necessary. He had to let them believe they were winning. He had to let them reveal their entire hand before he played his own. As the weekend wore on and the charade of his poverty became more entrenched, Samuel found himself retreating into the vast, silent archives of his memory. He was not the man his son and daughter-in-law saw. The image of the simple, slightly befuddled retiree struggling with bills and facing a bleak financial future was a carefully constructed fiction. The truth was far more complex and far more substantial. Samuel had not been born into wealth. He had been born into a world of grit and grime, the son of a steel worker in a town that smelled of coal smoke and quiet desperation. He had learned the value of hard work not from a textbook, but from the calluses on his father's hands. He had started his own life with nothing but a sharp mind, a relentless work ethic, and a deep, burning desire to build something that would last. He had started with a small machine shop, a single greasy lathe in a rented garage. He had worked 16-hour days, his hands stained with oil his mind constantly turning, innovating, improving. He had met Eleanor during those lean years. She was a librarian, a woman with a quiet strength and a belief in him that felt like a miracle. She had seen the king in him when he was still a pauper. Together, they had built an empire. His small machine shop had grown into a major manufacturing firm, a leader in specialized industrial components. He had not been a flashy CEO. He had been a quiet, relentless innovator, a man who understood the elegant dance of gears and the beautiful, brutal logic of the bottom line. He had earned his fortune not through speculation or inheritance, but through decades of sweat, sacrifice, and shrewd, calculated risks. But the wealth had never been the point. It had been a means to an end. The end was security, freedom, and the ability to provide for his family, to give his son, Robert, the life he had never had. He remembered Robert's childhood with a painful, bittersweet clarity. He had given his son everything: the best schools, the finest clothes, the most expensive toys. He had paid for his Ivy League education, for his MBA, for the down payment on his first house. He had done it all willingly, joyfully, believing he was building a foundation for his son's success. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. Robert had not inherited his father's grit, his hunger, his appreciation for the hard-won nature of success. He had inherited only the expectation of it. He had grown up surrounded by the fruits of his father's labor, and he had come to believe they were his by right. The first real sign of trouble had come years ago, shortly after Eleanor's diagnosis. Samuel, wanting to spend every possible moment with his wife, had decided to sell his company. The sale had been immensely profitable, leaving him with a fortune that would have allowed him to live a life of extravagant luxury. But he and Eleanor had chosen a different path. They had continued to live in their comfortable but modest home. They had set up a series of charitable foundations, donating vast sums to hospitals, universities, and arts organizations, and they had set aside a significant but not ostentatious inheritance for Robert. It was during this time that Samuel had overheard the conversation. He had been in his study, and Robert and Susan were in the living room, believing he was out for a walk. "He's just sitting on all that money," Susan had said, her voice a mixture of envy and resentment. "It's ridiculous. We could be doing so much with it, expanding the business, buying the lake house." "I know," Robert had replied, his voice low and conspiratorial. "But you know how he is, old-fashioned. He thinks we should earn it. He doesn't understand the modern world. It's not about earning it anymore. It's about leveraging it." The words had been a knife in Samuel's heart. They did not see his wealth as the product of a lifetime of hard work. They saw it as a resource, an asset to be leveraged. They saw him not as a father, but as an obstacle, a gatekeeper to the life they felt they deserved. It was then that he and Eleanor had made a decision. They had gone to their lawyer and restructured their entire estate. They had created a complex series of trusts and investments, designed to be almost invisible to an outside observer. They had not disinherited Robert. They had simply protected the bulk of their fortune, placing it in a secure discretionary trust that could only be accessed under specific circumstances that required a demonstration of character, not just a birth certificate. They had done it not to punish their son, but to protect him from his own worst instincts. They had hoped that, over time, he would mature, that he would find his own way, that he would learn the lessons his father had tried to teach him. But now, sitting in his quiet house, listening to the echoes of his grandson's warning, Samuel knew that the lesson had not been learned. Robert had not matured. He had simply become more cunning, more entitled, more desperate. The poor old man his son and daughter-in-law saw was a fiction. The real Samuel was a man of immense, hidden wealth, a man who could buy and sell his son's entire world without breaking a sweat, a man who had spent years preparing for this very moment, this very betrayal. He looked at the chessboard, at the pieces arranged in their silent, eternal conflict. He had been playing a long, patient game, and his son, in his arrogant, blind greed, had just made a fatal, foolish move. He had mistaken the king for a pawn, and he was about to be swept from the board. By Sunday evening, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from one of cloying concern to one of palpable, predatory anticipation. Robert and Susan were convinced that their performance had been a success. They had successfully cornered the poor, confused old man. They believed Samuel was broken, vulnerable, and ready to be managed. They had spent the afternoon making hushed, important-sounding phone calls, their voices full of a grim, self-righteous purpose. Samuel, for his part, played his role to perfection. He seemed more withdrawn, more fragile. He ate little at dinner, sighing heavily and complaining of a headache. He retired to his bedroom early, telling them he needed to rest, that all this worrying had taken its toll. "Of course, Dad," Robert had said, helping him to his feet with a show of filial piety that was almost comical in its insincerity. "You just rest. We'll take care of everything." Samuel closed his bedroom door, but he did not get into bed. Instead, he sat in the armchair in the corner, the one place in the room that was not visible from the hallway if the door was slightly ajar. He cracked the door open just a fraction of an inch, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness, and he waited. He didn't have to wait long. He heard the clink of glasses from the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. Then the low murmur of his son's voice, followed by Susan's sharp, clear reply. They were talking in what they thought were hushed tones, but in the silence of the old house, their words carried, clear and cold, to his listening ear. "He's completely bought it," Susan said, her voice laced with a triumphant, mocking tone. "The poor old fool. He actually thinks his investments have failed." He was practically in tears at dinner. "I almost felt sorry for him," Robert said, but there was no sorrow in his voice, only a cold, calculating satisfaction. "But we have to be strong for his own good. He's not capable of making rational decisions anymore." "His own good?" Susan laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't be so noble, darling. This is for our good. That house is worth a fortune. And once we sell it—" I know," Robert interrupted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But we have to handle this carefully. We can't just kick him out. It has to look like we're doing the right thing." Samuel felt a chill seep into his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the draft from the old windows. "So, what's the plan?" Susan asked. "We convince him to sell, and then what? We can't have him living with us. He'd drive me mad in a week." "Of course not," Robert said dismissively. "I've already been looking into it. There's a state-run facility just outside the city. Green Valley Meadows or something equally depressing. It's affordable." "Affordable," Susan repeated. You mean cheap. I mean practical, Robert corrected. Once the house is sold, the money goes into a joint account for his care. We'll control it. We can pay for the facility and the rest. The rest will be our compensation for all the years of stress and worry he's caused us. Compensation. The word was a physical blow. They saw their relationship with him not as one of love or duty, but as a long, burdensome investment for which they were now demanding payment. And what if he refuses to go? Susan asked. What if he puts up a fight? There was a long pause. Samuel held his breath. He won't, Robert said finally, his voice hard and devoid of any emotion, because he's old, and he's scared, and he thinks he's poor. And if he does put up a fight, well, there are ways. We can get a doctor to declare him incompetent. We can get power of attorney. At his age, with his financial confusion, no judge would question it. We'll tell him it's for his own protection. He let out a small, satisfied sigh. He'll be safe, he'll be cared for, and we'll be free. It's the perfect solution. He probably won't even notice the difference between this old house and a room at Green Valley. They're all the same to him now. Samuel closed his eyes. The ice in his veins had spread to his heart, freezing it solid. This was not just about greed. This was about erasure. They wanted to dispose of him, to pack him away in a cheap, state-run facility like a piece of old, unwanted furniture. They wanted to steal his home, his money, and his very identity. They had sentenced him to a living death, and they were congratulating themselves on their own cleverness and compassion. He listened as they began to discuss the details. The real estate agent they would call, the lawyer they would consult, the timeline for the sale. They spoke of his life's work, the home he had built with Eleanor as if it were nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet. He had heard enough. Quietly, he pushed his bedroom door closed, the soft click of the latch sealing him in with the terrible, liberating truth. He walked over to the window and looked out at the moonlit garden, at the roses Eleanor had planted, their petals silver in the pale light. He felt no sadness. He felt no anger. He felt only a profound, almost serene sense of clarity. The performance was over. The enemy had revealed their strategy, their motives, their ultimate objective. He now knew exactly what he had to do. He was not just fighting for his home. He was fighting for his life. And he would show them, with a precision and a ruthlessness they could not possibly imagine, what it truly meant to be old, to be wise, and to be underestimated. Samuel did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark of his bedroom, the moonlight tracing patterns on the floor, and he planned. The man who had spent the weekend playing the part of a frail, confused victim was gone. In his place was the man who had built an industrial empire from nothing, a man who understood strategy, leverage, and the cold, hard calculus of power. The next morning, he rose with the sun. He moved through his morning routine with a calm, unhurried deliberation. He made his coffee. He read the paper. He presented to Robert and Susan the same face of weary resignation they had come to expect. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told them over breakfast, his voice carefully modulated to sound tired and defeated. "About the house, about everything. Maybe you're right. It is a lot for one person to handle." He saw the flicker of triumph in their eyes, the barely suppressed smiles. They exchanged a quick, conspiratorial glance. "We're just thinking of you, Dad," Robert said, his voice oozing with false sincerity. "I know," Samuel said, looking down at his plate. "I know. I just need a little time to process it all." "Of course," Susan said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "Take all the time you need." They left shortly after breakfast, confident that their victory was assured. They had no idea that the moment their car pulled out of the driveway, Samuel's war began. His first call was not to a friend or a family member. It was to a man whose name was a legend in the world of corporate law, Julian Croft. Croft was a shark, a brilliant, ruthless litigator who had handled Samuel's business affairs for over 40 years. He was a man who understood the art of the silent, devastating attack. "Julian," Samuel said, his voice no longer frail but sharp and clear. "It's Samuel. I have a situation. I need you to be at my house in 1 hour and bring the paperwork for the Phoenix Trust." The Phoenix Trust was Samuel and Eleanor's masterpiece, the legal fortress they had built years ago to protect their true fortune. It was a complex, multi-layered entity, its assets spread across a dozen different holdings, its ownership structure deliberately opaque. It was designed to be invisible, untouchable, a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. Julian Croft arrived exactly 1 hour later, his leather briefcase full of documents. He listened, his face impassive, as Samuel recounted the events of the weekend, culminating in the overheard conversation. When Samuel had finished, Croft allowed himself a small, grim smile. "They've made a tactical error of catastrophic proportions," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "They've mistaken a lion for a lamb. What are your instructions, Samuel?" "I want to transfer everything," Samuel said, his voice cold and hard as steel. "The house, the stocks, the bonds, the art, every last cent. I want it all moved into the Phoenix Trust, effective immediately, and I want to change the beneficiary." "To whom?" Croft asked, already pulling out the necessary forms. "To my grandson," Samuel said, "Leo." For the next 4 hours, they worked. They signed documents, made secure calls to financial institutions in 3 different countries, and executed a series of complex legal maneuvers. With each signature, Samuel felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He was not just moving assets. He was building a fortress around his grandson's future. The trust was structured with meticulous care. Leo would be the sole beneficiary, but he would not gain full control until his 25th birthday. Until then, the trust would be managed by a board of 3 unimpeachable trustees: Julian Croft, Samuel's longtime accountant, and a retired judge who had been a close friend of Eleanor's. Samuel himself would be the trust's legal guardian, with the right to live in the house for the rest of his life and to draw a generous, but not extravagant, living stipend. The final piece of the plan was the will. "I want to amend it," Samuel told Croft. "I want to leave my son, Robert, and my daughter-in-law, Susan, the sum of $1 each." Croft raised an eyebrow. $1? "It's a symbolic gesture, Julian," Samuel explained. "It's to ensure they cannot contest the will on the grounds that they were accidentally omitted. I want it on record, for all time, that this was not an oversight. It was a choice." By late afternoon, it was done. The vast majority of Samuel's fortune, a lifetime of work and sacrifice, was now legally the property of his 10-year-old grandson. The house he was sitting in no longer belonged to him. He was, in a legal sense, a tenant in his own home, a home that was now owned by a trust for the benefit of the one person who had proven worthy of it. He walked Julian Croft to the door. "Thank you, my friend," he said, shaking the lawyer's hand. "It was my pleasure, Samuel," Croft replied, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "It's not every day you get to witness justice being served with such elegance." After Croft had gone, Samuel walked through his quiet house. It felt different. It felt safe. He had secured his legacy. He had protected his grandson. He had honored his wife. Now, all that was left was to wait for the enemy to walk into the trap, and he knew with a cold, thrilling certainty that they would not be kept waiting for long. 2 days later, they came for him. Robert and Susan arrived in the late afternoon, their faces arranged in masks of solemn, rehearsed concern. They were not alone. They had brought with them a woman in a sensible gray suit, a woman whose professional, vaguely therapeutic smile did not reach her eyes. "Dad," Robert said, his voice a low, gentle murmur as he led the woman into the living room. "This is Dr. Albright. She's a specialist in helping families navigate difficult transitions. We thought it would be helpful for her to be here." Samuel, who was sitting in his armchair by the window, looked up at the woman. He did not need to be a genius to understand her role. She was the expert, the impartial third party who would validate their decision, who would lend a veneer of professional legitimacy to their cruel, greedy plan. "A specialist," Samuel repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "How thoughtful of you." He gestured to the sofa opposite him. "Please, sit down." They arranged themselves on the sofa, a tribunal of 3, ready to pass judgment on his life. Robert sat in the middle, flanked by his wife and the specialist. He cleared his throat, a sound of manufactured gravity. "Dad," he began, leaning forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "Susan and I have been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of worrying. We love you very much, and we are deeply concerned about your well-being. We've seen how much you've been struggling since Mom passed." Susan chimed in, her voice dripping with false empathy. "And with your recent financial difficulties, we feel that this house has become a burden to you, a source of stress and anxiety." Samuel listened, his expression placid, his hands resting calmly on the arms of his chair. He let them talk. He gave them the stage, allowing them to perform their carefully scripted play. "It's not just the money, Dad," Robert continued. "It's the isolation, the loneliness. We don't think it's healthy for you to be here all by yourself. You need companionship. You need activities. You need professional care." Dr. Albright nodded sagely, a pen poised over a notepad. "It's very common at this stage of life," she said, her voice smooth and condescending. "A change of environment can be incredibly beneficial. It can provide a sense of community, of security." "Exactly," Susan said, seizing on the word. "Security. That's what this is all about. We found a wonderful place, Samuel. A beautiful facility with gardens, a library, a full staff of nurses, a place where you'll be safe and well cared for." She slid a glossy brochure across the coffee table. The cover showed a group of smiling, silver-haired seniors engaged in a game of lawn bowls. The name of the facility was printed in elegant gold script, Green Valley Meadows. The name hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. It was the same name he had heard them whisper in the dark of his own home. The affordable, state-run facility, the place they had chosen to dispose of him. He picked up the brochure. He looked at the smiling, generic faces, at the perfectly manicured lawns. He felt a wave of cold, clear rage, but he did not let it show. "It looks "Nice," he said, his voice a masterpiece of weary resignation. "It's more than nice, Dad," Robert said, his confidence growing. "It's the right thing to do. We've already spoken to the admissions director. They have a room available for you." "And the house?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What about my home?" "We'll take care of it," Susan said quickly, a little too quickly. "We'll handle the sale. The proceeds will go into an account for your care, of course. We'll manage everything, so you don't have to worry about a thing." They had laid it all out. The entire, ugly, premeditated plan. They had presented it to him as an act of love, an act of selfless concern. They sat there, waiting for his surrender, for his grateful, tearful acceptance of the fate they had chosen for him. Samuel placed the brochure back on the table. He looked at his son, at his daughter-in-law, at the specialist they had hired to legitimize their betrayal. He looked at their eager, expectant faces, and then he smiled. It was not a sad smile. It was not a defeated smile. It was a slow, quiet, and utterly terrifying smile. "You've been very busy," he said, his voice no longer frail, but full of a new, strange power. "You've planned everything so carefully, the facility, the sale of the house, the management of my care fund." Robert and Susan exchanged a nervous glance. This was not the reaction they had expected. "But there's just one small problem with your very thoughtful plan," Samuel continued, his smile widening. "What problem?" Robert asked, his voice suddenly wary. "The house," Samuel said, leaning back in his armchair. "You can't sell it." "Of course we can," Susan said, her voice sharp, "with your consent or with a court order, if necessary." "No," Samuel said, his voice calm and clear. "You can't sell it, because it doesn't belong to me anymore." He savored the look of pure, uncomprehending confusion on their faces. They stared at him as if he had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" Robert demanded. "I'm talking about the fact," Samuel said, his voice ringing with a quiet, triumphant finality, "that, as of yesterday morning, this house and every other asset I once owned now belongs to my grandson, Leo." The trap had been sprung. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence in the living room was a living thing, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. Robert and Susan stared at Samuel, their mouths slightly agape, their minds struggling to process the impossible words he had just spoken. Dr. Albright, the specialist, looked back and forth between them, her professional composure beginning to crumble, a dawning realization on her face that she had walked into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple family intervention. What did you say?" Robert finally stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I said," Samuel repeated, his voice calm and deliberate, each word a perfectly placed stone in the wall of their ruin, "that this house, the stocks, the bonds, the art, the bank accounts, everything you were so kindly planning to manage for me, now belongs to a trust, the sole beneficiary of which is my grandson, Leo." Susan let out a small, strangled sound, a cross between a gasp and a sob. That's not possible," she said, shaking her head in denial. "You can't do that. We're your family. We have rights." "Rights?" Samuel's voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "What rights, Susan? The right to declare me incompetent? The right to sell my home from under me? The right to ship me off to a state-run facility so you can live off the proceeds of my life's work? I don't recall seeing those rights outlined in any legal or moral code." At that moment, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. Samuel didn't move. He simply smiled. "I believe that's for me," he said. He had arranged it all with Julian Croft. The timing was perfect. A moment later, the housekeeper showed a man into the living room. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, conservative suit, and carried a slim leather briefcase. It was Julian Croft, Samuel's lawyer. "Julian," Samuel said, his voice warm and welcoming, "thank you for coming. I hope we're not interrupting your day." "Not at all, Samuel," Croft said, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the scene, the stunned couple on the sofa, the flustered specialist, the glossy brochure for Green Valley Meadows still sitting on the coffee table. "It seems I've arrived at a pivotal moment." "Indeed," Samuel said. "My son and daughter-in-law were just expressing their deep concern for my well-being. They've even brought a specialist to help me navigate my transition." Croft allowed himself a small, cold smile. He turned to Robert and Susan. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice the epitome of professional courtesy. "My name is Julian Croft. I am Mr. Samuel Miller's legal counsel. He asked me to be here today to clarify a few points regarding his estate." He opened his briefcase and took out a thick, bound document. "This," he said, placing it on the coffee table with a soft, definitive thud, "is a copy of the legally executed, irrevocable trust agreement for the Phoenix Trust, which now holds all of Mr. Miller's former assets. As you can see on page 1, the sole beneficiary is Mr. Leo Miller." Robert stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. "This is a trick," he said, his voice rising with a desperate, panicked anger. "He's an old man. He's confused. You've manipulated him." Croft's smile did not waver. "On the contrary, Mr. Miller, your father has never been more lucid. We have, of course, taken the precaution of having his competency certified by 3 independent neurologists and a forensic psychiatrist. Their reports are attached as appendices C through F. I believe you'll find them quite thorough." He then turned his attention to Dr. Albright. "And you, madam," he said, his voice losing its professional warmth and taking on a dangerous, icy edge. "I would be very careful about any diagnosis you were planning to make today. My client has a recording of a conversation in which his son and daughter-in-law discuss their plan to have you declare him incompetent in exchange for a generous donation to your research foundation. We have already forwarded that recording, along with your professional license number, to the State Medical Board and the District Attorney's Office. I believe they will be very interested in your methods for navigating difficult transitions." Dr. Albright went pale. She shot a look of pure venom at Robert and Susan, snatched her purse, and practically fled from the room without another word. The room was silent again, the departure of the specialist leaving a vacuum of pure, unadulterated reality. "You recorded us," Susan whispered, her face a mask of horror. "You discussed my living death in my own home," Samuel replied, his voice quiet but unyielding. "You planned my exile. You celebrated my poverty. Did you really think I wouldn't take precautions?" He stood up and walked over to the coffee table. He picked up the glossy brochure for Green Valley Meadows. "This was your plan for me," he said, holding it up. "A cheap, forgotten end in a place where no one would have to think about me. a place where I would be safe and you would be free." He looked at his son, at the man he had raised, the man he had loved. "You wanted my house, Robert," he said, his voice breaking with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "You wanted my money, but you were never willing to take what I was always offering you for free, my love, my respect, my time." He let the brochure fall from his fingers. It fluttered to the floor, a pathetic, glossy monument to their greed. "Well," he said, his voice regaining its strength, "you won't have my money, you won't have my house, and now you no longer have my respect." He turned to his lawyer. "Julian, I believe we are finished here." Croft nodded. "Indeed. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, I would advise you to find your own legal counsel. You're going to need it. You're currently trespassing on property owned by the Phoenix Trust. I would ask you to vacate the premises immediately." Vacate the premises. The words hung in the air, a stunning, brutal reversal of their own intentions. They had come to evict him, and now they were the ones being thrown out. The revelation was complete. Their world had not just been shaken, it had been utterly and completely demolished. The aftermath of the revelation was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, quiet collapse. Robert and Susan stumbled out of the house in a daze, their faces pale with the shock of their utter and complete defeat. They did not shout. They did not argue. They were broken, hollowed-out shells of the confident, entitled people who had walked in just an hour before. Samuel watched them go from the living room window. He saw them get into their expensive car, the car he had helped them buy, and drive away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the ruins of a family. He felt no triumph. He felt no joy. He felt only a profound, weary sadness for the son he had lost and for the man that son had chosen to become. In the weeks and months that followed, the full consequences of their actions unfolded. The district attorney's office, armed with Samuel's recordings and Julian Croft's meticulous documentation, launched a full-scale investigation into their finances. They were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted elder abuse. The legal battle was short and brutal. They lost everything. Their house, their cars, their savings, all were seized to pay for legal fees and court-ordered restitution. They were left with nothing but their shame and the $1 inheritance that Samuel had so carefully bequeathed them. Samuel, meanwhile, began to build a new life. He remained in his home, but it was no longer just his. It was Leo's. He was its guardian, its caretaker, its living memory. He spent his days in the garden, tending to Eleanor's roses, his hands in the rich, dark earth. He found a peace there that he had not known in years. He did not tell Leo about the trust. He did not want to burden the boy with the knowledge of such wealth, or with the terrible truth of his parents' betrayal. He simply wanted to be his grandfather. He made a choice. He would not raise his grandson in the shadow of what had happened. He would raise him in the light. He began to teach Leo, not about money or business, but about the things that truly mattered. He taught him the names of the constellations on clear summer nights. He taught him how to build a sturdy bookshelf with his own 2 hands. He taught him the quiet, patient art of chess. He taught him about Eleanor, not as a distant, sainted memory, but as a vibrant, loving woman. He would read to Leo from her favorite books of poetry, his voice soft in the quiet of the evening. He would tell him stories of their life together, of their struggles, of their triumphs, of their deep, abiding love. Your grandmother believed that the greatest wealth a person could have, he told Leo one afternoon as they sat by the chessboard, was a good character. Money comes and goes, she used to say, but your character, that's the one thing you build yourself, and the one thing no one can ever take away from you. Leo, who was growing into a thoughtful, compassionate young man, absorbed these lessons like a thirsty plant absorbs water. He spent every weekend, every holiday with his grandfather. Their bond, which had always been strong, deepened into something profound. A partnership built on a foundation of love, trust, and a shared, unspoken understanding. One day, years later, when Leo was a young man on the cusp of his 18th birthday, he and Samuel were sitting in the garden. "Grandpa," Leo said, his voice quiet, "I know about the trust, about everything." Samuel looked at his grandson, at the kind, intelligent eyes that were so much like his grandmother's. "How long have you known?" "A while," Leo admitted. "I found some of the old legal papers in your study a few years ago. I didn't understand them all at first, but I figured it out." He paused, his gaze steady. "You did it for me, didn't you? You gave it all to me." "No, son," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't give it to you. I returned it to you. It was always meant to be yours. Your grandmother and I, we built it for the future, for a child who would understand its true value. And that child was you." He reached out and placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Your parents, they thought the inheritance was the money. They never understood. The real inheritance, Leo, is not the wealth. It's the values. It's the love. It's the responsibility to use what you have to do good in the world." Leo nodded, his eyes shining with tears. "I understand, Grandpa," he said. "I promise. I won't let you down." Samuel smiled, a deep, contented smile that reached his soul. He had lost a son, but he had gained something far more precious. He had gained the certainty that his legacy, the true legacy of his and Eleanor's life, was safe. It was not in a bank vault or a stock portfolio. It was in the heart of the good, kind, and honorable young man sitting beside him. He had made his choice. He had chosen his grandson, and in doing so he had ensured that the story of his family would not end in a chapter of greed and betrayal, but would begin a new, more hopeful volume, one written with love, integrity, and the quiet, enduring strength of a grandfather's faith.